So hi everyone, my name is Jade Domain and I serve as the chair of the SACAC Webinars Committee. I am joined by a webinar committee member, Shelby Keel from Georgia Tech, who's going to be doing behind the scenes work on our webinar. So if you need anything during the presentation, just let Shelby know. She's going to be monitoring the chat box and she should be able to assist you. Disclaimer, I do want to say you all great work in giving us really great questions. I know that the panelists are going to kind of acknowledge that piece, but it does mean that in order to get through all of your questions, we might not have a whole lot of time for Q&A at the end. If we do, we will definitely make sure to let you know, and I'll kind of be monitoring, Shelby and I will be monitoring the Q&A box. If you do have a pertinent question as they're kind of talking about something, you can go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll give the opportunity to acknowledge that question. I want to welcome you to our third and final webinar of the session, of the season, Why Allies Great Till They Gotta Be Great Part 2. So I'm sure some of you were part of the conversation that we are revisiting that happened during our summer webinar series. Please know that this meeting is being recorded and will be shared with SACAC members after the program. And with that, I want to pass things over to Ashley to get started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. To those of you who are joining us again, and to anyone new, we really appreciate you being here, especially during such a hectic time in our professions on both sides of the desk. And I know everyone's waiting for hopefully a break that they're going to be getting, even though we might work a little during the break, unfortunately. But we do hope that you can find some time to disconnect and spend time with your families. We are really excited to do a part 2 of this. We are missing Brandy Smith, the amazing Brandy Smith, and she helped us kind of conceive this for our second one, but we're super excited to welcome Morgan Fowler from High Point. Morgan's amazing, and it was really a great opportunity and experience putting this together and talking through a lot of these things. And thank you again for all of the amazing questions that you all posed and added when you registered. It really helped us determine what we thought you might want to hear about and how to kind of move forward with the presentation. And for those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Ashley Armato. I am a Senior Associate Director of College Counseling and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Coordinator at Palmer Trinity School in Miami, Florida. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. I identify as Latina, a white passing Latina. So we're talking about privilege as white passing women, women of color, and hopefully we can talk about how our intersectional identities affect how we do this important work of supporting one another, and particularly supporting women of color in our profession. And with that, I'll hand it off to Morgan to introduce herself.
Hi, so I'm Morgan Fowler. I am a senior admissions counselor at High Point University in Central North Carolina. I do identify as Black female. Pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm really excited to be a part of this panel. Ashley and Shannon have been mentors to me through my 3 years, so it's really amazing to be a part of this with them.
Hi there, I'm Shannon Barrio. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of College Counseling at Metairie Park Country Day in Louisiana. Metairie is just outside of New Orleans, and welcome to the webinar.
All right, so we wanted to give a quick recap, some salient points from our last presentation to kind of usher us into the part 2. So one of the first things we wanted to reiterate is the fact that anyone can be an ally or an accomplice. There are different ways to talk about the language behind being an ally or accomplice. Many folks are preferring accomplice as more of an action verb and more less passive than an ally. It really embodies the idea of actually showing up and putting action behind your words if you are trying to support folks in racial justice movements or any social justice movements in particular. And we want to remind everyone that you can be an accomplice or an ally at any position or any level. There's, especially as white people or white passing people, the privilege and power that you have in being able to use your voice, and if you have a seat at the table, to say something, to offer support, to step in, to take action. You can do that at any level. Support your students, amplify their voices when necessary. And again, it's not just someone who's at a VP level or director level. That's something that can happen anywhere. And it's important that people find allies and accomplices at all different levels within their organization, both in a supervisory role and also in lateral roles with your colleagues as well. I think it's tough to sit back and think about when you are an accomplice, a lot of times you have to have hard conversations with folks. They're necessary conversations. People call them courageous sometimes. They're tough conversations that need to happen, and they're not always comfortable. And you need to lean into the discomfort of having the conversations to change things. Otherwise, nothing does change. And you have to be okay with sitting in the discomfort sometimes, be okay with making a mistake and then rebounding from it. And just waking up every day, trying to do the work and figuring out what that looks like for you in your life and where you are. And again, allyship, being an accomplice, it's not a noun, it's a verb. So there's action behind it. So be thoughtful in terms of how you show that action and where you can act in the roles that you have.
Educating yourself on cultures and communities that are different from your own is the first step in becoming an anti-racist advocate. I come from very white spaces. I went to predominantly white schools. I was thinking back, and I think that I had my first teacher of color as a foreign language teacher in 9th grade. And I'm not sure I was ever educated by a Black teacher through graduate school. After graduate school, my license is in professional counseling. So I come to the field from mental health, and I worked through my 20s in only Black communities in New Orleans. And I was welcomed into schools and homes that were very different than I had grown up in. And it really started to challenge the way I was raised and how subtly racist the environment I was raised was. And then when I was about 30, I went back to work in the school counseling department of the high school that I went to. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school with about 600 students. Maybe 10% of those students were Black students. And as an educator in that space, I was able to kind of look back on my own high school experience. And one of the first books that I read was Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Tatum, because it was still happening. And I remember that happening when I was a student, and I really wanted to understand that. And then just couldn't stop educating myself from there. There was so many opportunities to do that in literature, but also just kind of digging into slavery and the civil rights movement and just kind of reading a lot. But most recently, I think it's been important I've looked at my social media feeds probably in the last really 5 years to see who I'm following and who I'm hearing from and listening to. So I'll give a little shout out to the people that I'm loving right now. Blair Amani, if you're not familiar with her, she's a Black bisexual Muslim. She does her stories called Smarter in Seconds on all kinds of equity issues. I highly recommend her. At the Table 360 is where college admissions counselors come together. Black and Indigenous and people of color come together to have community and support. It's a public page. There's also a private page on Facebook. But the public page, I've been able to listen to voices in our profession specifically. I don't recommend necessarily jumping into that conversation, but it's been really helpful for me in supporting colleagues of color in the profession. And then of course the Black at pages, if you're not familiar with those, you can look up Black at a high school or Black at a college and really start to listen and hear the experience of your Black students in predominantly white institutions. And then it's not just professional kind of pages that I follow. I just really have changed my feed significantly to learn more about people that don't look like me. There's 2 pages that I follow, The Great Out Chair and Canapé. They're both Black women who hike and camp mostly on their own and cook delicious meals, which is just something that I'm interested in, but it's been a different perspective than what I would traditionally have in my feed. And then at Earthly, Tatiana is a single Native mom, young, and I really appreciate her perspective and learning about Native culture that way. But actively seek out and listen to others' experiences, even if and especially if they make you uncomfortable. But remember that true solidarity is in your action post that education. What are you doing with the tools that you are learning about moving forward? I think that as a white person, understanding the privilege that you bring to the table is really important. When you have privilege, equity can feel like oppression. When you've been part of a dominant culture your whole life and maybe even haven't realized it until later on, sharing that privilege or figuring out how to share that privilege and give up some of that power can feel unfair. But I encourage you to sit with that and kind of make that a jumping off point. And when Black, Indigenous, and people of color ask white people to acknowledge their privilege, it's not an attack. It doesn't feel great just when you start to realize how often you've benefited from privilege, but having privilege does not make you a bad person. And resist there's some guilt that will inevitably come up with that. I think it's important to be mindful of who you process your guilt with. And in thinking about this presentation, when and how to be an ally, a lot of white people ask like concrete ways in which they can be an ally. I think that being that person you process other white people's guilt with, it can be one way to be an ally, because expressing your guilt to your colleagues of color really will center white feelings, and it's not about us. And try not to insert your personal experiences into a narrative that's not about you. And sometimes we do that just to relate to a conversation on all topics, right? We're having a conversation with someone and you're like, well, wait, this happened to me, or I have a similar experience. But being mindful of what you're trying to learn and who with is important.
So moving on from that, in the sense with allies, don't expect praise. In some senses, it will happen. I had a situation this weekend where one of my allies stood up for me in a way that I hadn't seen in a really long time, and that was amazing. But also knowing that she would have done it even if I wasn't there was even more impactful for me. So a lot of the time, it's crazy to think that just being anti-racist is kind of the basic. And that's kind of the thought process that I'm starting to move into. And I think a lot of my friends and allies are starting to move into, of like, this is really, the end of the day, the bare minimum. And we're just kind of now getting to that. And so it really is focusing on the impact that you're having on the other, those that are underrepresented, those that are not as privileged in the spaces that you're in, just because you can be so helpful in that. And so it's not about the attention that you get afterwards, or necessarily the validation of like, oh my gosh, you did such a great job. That was absolutely amazing, because that won't always happen. We aren't always there to see it. And so, but one thing that my mom has always said is that what happens behind closed doors will come into the light. Like that idea of who you are, like it will shine through. And so one of my really good friends and colleagues actually has this one quote that I absolutely love. And whenever, I think she knows it by heart, but I definitely don't. Your desire to be seen as good can actually prevent you from doing good, because if you do not see yourself as part of the problem, you simply cannot be part of the solution. And that just resonates in such an amazing way, because it's really about who we are, right? It's not the words allies and accomplices. That's nice, but do you need them all the time, right? Like just kind of in that perspective and that thought, I guess. And so then from that, just keeping the same energy. Civil rights and racial injustice and everything that's going on, it's not a fad. It definitely helps to be able to have these different resources and be able to see it on social media, and the fact that everything is coming to the light a little bit more often because technology has just moved forward in this way. But just because you're not seeing it doesn't mean it isn't happening. Just because you didn't see it today doesn't mean that it didn't happen today. And so in that thought of keeping with this fight and this movement, no matter where you are, no matter what the time frame is, just because over the summer, I think a lot of organizations especially were kind of like, all right, we need to get on this. And so ask yourself, is your organization still kind of doing that in the same way? Are you still doing that in the same way? I don't think everybody's able to say yes to that. And so just kind of reflecting on that and thinking about it is really important. Because also, again, with not looking for praise and expecting praise, what happens, especially in the holidays right now, like when you are at your all white family Christmas table, and what happens then when uncle or aunt or cousin just says something really out of pocket? How are you moving through that? Are you really sitting up and saying something? Or are you just kind of being like, all right, well, it's fine, I guess. So those different spaces, again, that you occupy, it can be really impactful of what you do and what you say, because it also just kind of represents who you are. And so one way that it's really cool to do this, and I've been focusing on this a little bit more, not just in advocating, but also supporting, like Black art, media, charity, schools, businesses, everything, to kind of pull in social media. I follow what's called the official Black Wall Street on Instagram. And so in June, they did this really, really cool thing where every day, it's a scroller, like you have to scroll to get all the way to June, but every single day they gave a different lists of businesses with a theme. So it was like nail care and hair care, and like spices and sauces and travel accommodations. So like all of these different businesses, like things I had never even thought of like, yeah, there are Black businesses out there that I can really go and look into and really support. Finding out that all of my hair products were not Black owned was one of the biggest shocks of my life. And so making sure to, having pivoted in that, of being able to support Black owned businesses and what that means. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Morgan. All right, so like I mentioned earlier, we are taking a lot of the questions that you all submitted when you registered and answering those. And we envision this as a free-flowing conversation on the topics. We'll all chime in and give our perspectives and add. And we are lucky that our webinar leadership for SACAC is here, and they're going to help see if there are any follow-up questions that you all have that are pertinent to what we're talking about, and they'll chime in and let us know if there's anything that we could expand on that would be helpful as you're hearing what we're saying. So please feel free to kind of add anything that you think would be helpful and kind of goes with what we're saying in the moment. And like we said, we hope we have time for some of your questions at the end, but we have a lot of content here, so hopefully we answer some of those questions along the way as well. Okay, so first one, what is important nomenclature you would like to see more of, and what terms or phrases would you like to see less of? I can start just in terms of discussing what terms are in, what terms aren't. I think there's a constant quest in this work, in social justice work, to find things that decenter whiteness and center traditionally marginalized or oppressed groups. So I think that as people really delve into that and think of that and do more, there's more scholarship around it, I think new terms arise, and we continue to educate ourselves and learn about new ways that we can express what we're experiencing and what we're seeing. I know from talking with colleagues and friends, and the word minority by some people is not used, or people would prefer to not put the emphasis on othering others. And I know people have used underrepresented. Again, that's still putting the focus on that group. And I think in conversation with Shannon, we were talking about historically excluded as a way to kind of decenter the systems that have, caused people to be underrepresented or seen as minorities in this country. I don't know, Shannon, if you wanted to add anything more to that with historically excluded. You're muted, sorry.
It's a fairly new term for me, but it made a lot of sense because there's a reason why Black, Indigenous, and people of color are underrepresented in the systems, especially in our education systems and in higher education. So that shift for me, I was never really comfortable using the word minority, and then underrepresented is used wildly, but historically excluded just really made sense, and I've made that shift from underrepresented to historically excluded, or have tried to in my language. Yeah.
Yeah, I think along that same vein, I've seen folks de-emphasize decolonize and instead use re-indigenize, again, putting the focus and emphasis on the group that needs to kind of enter the conversation more. And then other ones I can speak to, Latino, Hispanic, Latinx. It's going to depend on who you speak to. And I think in general, asking people how they would prefer to be referred to or as, and listening to how people describe themselves, I think that's probably your best bet in terms of trying not to choose a term for somebody else. Latino is more of a politicized term, I would say. It's something that came after, especially the US government kind of gave a name to folks who were coming from or Spanish-speaking countries. And a lot of people do prefer Latino over Hispanic, but Hispanic is very, very popular in the Southwest, in Florida, where I am. Growing up in New York, we called ourselves Spanish. A lot of people still do in Boston and New York, just because you're using the language you speak to identify your identity and culture. And I didn't really realize until I went to college that that was not correct. I didn't eat Spanish food growing up. That someone Spanish is from Spain, but growing up, that's what we called ourselves. It's what my mom refers to herself as sometimes if she's not using her nationality or where she was born. So again, it's just kind of cultural at that point. Latinx, there's controversy over that term as well. Many folks see Latinx as an inclusive term that's not using the gendered Latino or Latina. And it's including people who are gender nonconforming or non-binary. Other folks find it to be offensive because it's a made-up word, that it's using kind of American perspective and agenda to change a language, and that it shouldn't be changed in that way. The counter to that can be that Spanish in and of itself was the language of colonizers, so it's not, an indigenous language either. So you could go in circles with that. And again, I think, understanding some of, those nuances is really important, but at the end of the day, asking people what they prefer and just following that is probably your best bet in terms of which one to use.
Yeah, and so with that, I'm from the South. I say y'all. Just when it comes to anybody, a collective group, you all is maybe more proper, I don't know. But then also folks of just, again, what people, it's really, really is based off of what people identify as and what they're most comfortable with. Because I do have friends on each side of the spectrum, especially when it comes to Latina, Latino, Latinx. And so that just being much more of a conversation, but also it also kind of moves into the idea of pronouns. Of when someone lets you know what their preference is, that's just kind of what you go with. And that when it comes to African American and Black, I don't take issue with it, but at the end of the day, I am Black. I didn't know what my African heritage was until I did 23andMe, and now I'm pushing my parents to do it. But like, that's where it comes from. I didn't necessarily know prior to that what my heritage was. And even if it was African, maybe it was Caribbean, I had no idea. So in my head, I am Black, I am a Black female, like I said earlier, but I do have friends that really like that focus of African American and being called that, and that's how they identify, and that's completely fine. Again, what people are most comfortable with and how they identify with a lot of these.
And I think that you can ask people, hopefully, how they would like to be referred to. But as a white person, I've become comfortable, especially in New Orleans. I find that a lot of Black people refer to themselves as Black and aren't identifying as much with the African American piece. But being comfortable using the word Black is ask people how they want to be referred to. But I've become more comfortable using that word, and just be mindful of when you're writing it to capitalize it. And For pronouns, my pronouns are she, her. I don't prefer to be she, her, but I am she, her. So I think when you ask a student, what are your pronouns is appropriate. This racial equity tools glossary is amazing. We will share it. I believe we're going to share the whole presentation. But this is something that I came across preparing for this presentation, and I immediately sent it out to my school. We have a professional development day on Friday, and there's a diversity, equity, inclusion piece. But it's very comprehensive, and it's a great way to educate yourself on language, because language is so important as we have these conversations.
And then just in terms of being intersectional, again, with the preferred pronouns and pronouns, we also wanted to mention using you guys, y'all, if you're from the South, or if you want to adopt it. Folks is also, popularized and spelled with an X, again, just to be more intersectional and represent people who are, of different genders, gender non-conforming. It's just a way to show that you are welcome, open, accepting, recognizing other people's identities, and willing to have those conversations, and perhaps can be a safe space for a person when they see you use that kind of language.
And we think about supporting students of color in our organizations. Morgan had mentioned this earlier, but intent versus impact. You may have the best intentions, but truly listening to how your words and actions impact your students. And if students aren't necessarily comfortable articulating that to you, or you're finding that they're not being open with you, or you're not getting enough information, I think that those Black at Instagram pages are really helpful to go see how your unintended intentions can impact student populations. When I was reading the Instagram pages, the Black ats, undermatching was something that students mentioned a lot, that they felt like their college lists were far different than their white peers, and felt like that there was a lot of racism in that. I see this in scheduling and placement. I really try to take inventory of the courses that our students are in, our students of color are in earlier in the process. I was finding that when I got to the students as juniors and saw their transcripts, and I had students of color with straight A's, but they were all in standard courses, and it was almost too late to, layer in some rigor, and they were super talented. And so I've tapped into the middle school because I found that our math courses by 6th grade, once you decide you had to be placed in honors almost in the middle school to make it into honors in the upper school, which is problematic also, but catching it early enough to make a difference, or taking inventory with your 9th grade schedules. This can be hard in larger populations. I do understand that, but making your departments and your faculty aware of the importance of challenging all students. Connecting, I think Morgan, you had mentioned connecting with the educators that serve as mentors to students of color. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I remember going through my college process, and I went to a larger public school in northern Florida. And I walked into my counselor's office that first week, and she was like, looked at me, looked at my grades, and then was kind of like, oh, okay, so, and listed off 2 HBCUs and then 2 public Florida schools. And I was like, I'm not applying to any of those. I was like, it's not who I am. That doesn't really fit what my ideals are and everything else. And it was really interesting to me because I'm not sure what happened in the conversation that really resonated with her, but she made a point to go talk to one of my track coaches and try and get a better understanding of who I was and where I was coming from, not just me, but some of my other friends that were athletes as well. And that next meeting was something completely different. And she helped me find my dream school. And so just in the sense of, it was super impactful for me specifically, of her taking a step back and saying, okay, there are other educators of color on this campus that maybe do know her or these students a little bit better. So why don't I kind of tap into that resource? And so that is something that's always resonated with me, and kind of got me into this kind of college process job to begin with, career.
I think that's super important too. Just taking the extra initiative to learn more about your students, not treating them like monoliths, understanding that everyone's experience is going to be different. And I know there's lots of conversations about doing college counseling and admissions work with an anti-racist lens, and really embracing that. And I think learning, educating yourself, trying to recognize what you don't understand or what you have less experience with. I know at my school in particular, I think our student body, probably 4% are African American or Black. So, when we're looking at data for schools on SCORE, which is what we use right now, we don't have a huge data set to help. So that means I will contact colleagues that work in more diverse schools. I'll go out of my way to contact admissions folks at schools to ask, because I don't ever want to undermatch a student just because I don't have data that supports something. So I think you have to do that extra legwork to figure out, because these institutions, aren't built for students of color, and we're trying to fix the institutions from within. But in the meantime, how do we address some of these concerns and the issues and make sure that we can serve our students? And then I think one of the things we touched on also when we say, speak out when you hear microaggressions, be confident when you speak about affirmative action. You need to learn to be able to say those things so that your students hear you and see you as an ally or an advocate for them as well. I think something really disappointing is when adults don't speak up or speak out when they hear things. And particularly when decisions start rolling in and people start saying, oh, well, so-and-so only got in because they're Black, because they're Latinx, because of this. That's when you need to kind of shut that conversation down and educate. I think it's really, really important to be able to feel confident with language and practice it if you have to, alone or with a friend. Practice it so that you can say the right thing in the right moment if you need to.
And I'll just say that this one's really, really difficult. And it took me a long time before I had the confidence to check white parents when they made comments about diversity and admissions. And, with diversity these days, I don't know, it's going to be really hard for my really bright white child to get into the school. And I had to practice my answers. I have canned answers now. And that equity feels like oppression when you're used to privilege is one that I use now, because it kind of shuts the conversation down. But also, why do you feel like your student has a right to this position any more than a qualified applicant of color? And so I have never had, I was fearful that perhaps I would get in trouble or lose my job. And it's happened recently over the years, the last, 2 years, and I haven't had any pushback. I think that it helps people think. I think that it definitely could get pushback, and I'm confident in that risk, but that is part of being an ally, is speaking up consistently.
Okay. How do you have conversations with white allies who believe that they are doing the work but continue to do so with outdated practices? This is one we kind of toyed with for a minute, just because the different spaces that we occupy in this occupation. So it's always about kind of starting the conversation. We kind of goes back to realizing that this isn't a fad to kind of keep with the same energy. And so if you see someone that it's not necessarily the energy has changed, but they haven't gotten to the same level that you are, sometimes it's just an easier conversation to have with them one-on-one. One thing that I had to be really cognizant of is the fact that I sometimes, for just sanity reasons, my social media is like-minded to me. My friends, the things that I see, they are constantly updating and upgrading and educating and everything else. But just because it's normal for me doesn't mean it's normal for everyone else, doesn't mean that that's what they're seeing on their feed. It doesn't mean that they're kind of getting those updates and upgrades. And so sometimes if you see it happen and then afterwards kind of going to them and being like, hey, you did this, that was awesome. Maybe try this next time too. And like kind of that positive reaffirming of what they did, but then also, hey, these are other steps that you can take with that and moving forward, because this is a movement. It has to keep moving forward. And so helping them understand the different ways that they can move forward is really how you can help your ally be better in all of the different spaces that they're in. But sometimes it is you kind of just taking that first step and feeling comfortable enough in your knowledge, knowing that this is going to be beneficial at the end of the day to go ahead and do that.
I would also add that if especially if you're in a supervisory role where you have the ability to kind of set the tone for your office, for, the folks that you work with regularly, making sure that you have conversations that surround social justice and DEI, and really letting those who work with you understand that you're open to the conversations, that you're willing to learn. I think just setting that tone, if you have the power, and privilege to do so, is really important, because then people will know that you mean well, and that if you do something that, is outdated, or if you use terminology, that isn't correct necessarily, that you want to do better and you're willing to have that advice and get that critical feedback back. I think that's really important. So if you can set a tone for that, I think that helps that happen also. And in general, I think being aware of, I have white passing privilege, understanding that I can probably have a conversation with someone in a way that might not come off as threatening, because of lots of racial biases that people have. I can talk to white colleagues and allies about things that might be able to be educational for them, and they might take it from me. And I think that's part of the role that I play in this. If I can have a seat at a table, or if I can engage in those conversations, that's a responsibility on my part, because of privilege. I need to be willing to have those conversations, even if they're not necessarily fun for me, or, their work and they're taxing, but it's part of doing that work too. So just being aware of just relationally, what kind of work you can do based on the relationships that you have, and how you can just help people do this work in a way that will essentially help support, people of color and people of other groups in the long run.
I think it can be, I imagine it is intimidating to have a white supervisor as a professional of color, and see them not show up for you. Somebody had mentioned that in the chat, like, I have a supervisor who is working on being an ally, it sounds like that, but consistently doesn't show up when it matters. And I'm wondering if in that situation you can say, I appreciate your allyship and I want to continue to have conversations, but when you aren't showing up, or I'm noticing that, are you open to feedback on that? I know personally, I'd want to know those times when I'm not showing up, and she might also recognize that she's not showing up, wanting to do better, not having the confidence, but having that dialogue might give her more confidence. And I know that puts the burden on you as a professional of color. If you have that relationship with her, it might be a place to start if she's really not getting it and not showing up when you need her to.
What techniques would you suggest to call people into a conversation instead of calling them out? We had fun with this one because it was a lot of education for us, as well as kind of what is calling into and what is calling out, and kind of how do you balance that. And so for me, I'm very big on kind of like the short phrases of like reminders for me going into different situation, is that you want to focus on discussion without disruption. And that's just really big in the sense of there's so many different spaces that calling out and calling in could happen. If it's the public versus private, but also where and when. It's such a circumstantial question. And so I think for me specifically, as a BIPOC professional in a pretty white space, having those conversations individually really helps. Being able to pull aside is kind of more for calling into for me. But one thing, I kind of always go back to my family. One thing that my family has always been big about is that your apology should be just as loud as your disrespect. I've had the conversations before where it is a private conversation of like, hey, this happened, wasn't okay with it, don't feel comfortable. And sometimes you will get that question of like, okay, well, like, what can I do? What can I do to make it better? Okay, well, the next time we're in that meeting, I would like you to apologize for what you did in the previous meeting. And a lot of allies are okay with doing that. They really do understand, again, going back to that impact and what it means. So really focusing on the conversation, and that it is focused on growth and you wanting to help them in that regard. Hopefully that impact for them also being positive, but also choosing the spaces that you do it in can be really important to how that impact happens and how you move forward in that situation.
I would add too, when we were talking about this in terms of disruption versus discussion, and it's also going to really depend on what was said, and again, the spaces and what harm was done in that moment, because sometimes a conversation, you just need to stop the conversation where it is before further harm is done. And it's tough to do that with the kind of tact that might be considered calling in. And I also wanted to add that there's a resource page at the end. Again, we're sharing the presentation with some language that might be helpful in terms of calling in versus calling out, just to help folks become comfortable with, the ways to actually do it effectively. But again, sometimes you need to stop a conversation before it goes forward. And sometimes that can seem abrupt and it might seem like you're calling someone out, but you need to protect people versus protecting, feelings of the aggressor sometimes. So you have to make that judgment call. And again, there's, privilege and power embedded in that too, depending on who you are, who the offender is, if they're your supervisor, if there's a lot of things, like Morgan said, it's really situational, but there is a point where sometimes you have to call people out, and it has to be a little bit abrupt because you don't want harm done. And that's more important than hurt feelings at the end of the day, and centering that versus centering someone's being safe in a space.
And another one of the phrases that I think I talked about while we were doing this is balancing grace and accountability. I think that gives you the tone. I think that frames the conversation. But it also, for the person that is calling in or calling out, it does take a lot for you to decide how that balance works. And sometimes you have to decide that the grace that you're giving is for yourself, not for the other person. Because I know I've had different conversations where I look back on it and I was like, oh, you could have been nicer, or like, you could have said it this way, or you could have said it that way. And so being able to do that prior to having that conversation for me has really helped on that back end of me not feeling bad or uncomfortable or feeling like that relationship has changed in a way, but really making sure that, again, that the grace is for me and my sanity and my mental health and everything that goes into having to put myself in that situation.
Okay, how do I balance both speaking up and passing the mic? This one can be difficult for me. Sometimes I'm very vocal, and I am very vocal, and I sometimes go into a department chair meeting and I'm like, I am not going to speak the whole meeting. Try not to talk. It's very hard for me, but I think it's just taking inventory of how often you are a voice and not speaking over other allies or BIPOC colleagues. At the same time, know when it's necessary to speak up. It is a difficult balance, I think, especially if you just tend to be a very vocal person. But for me personally, I constantly take inventory of who's at the table, who gets a chance to speak at the table? Am I dominating the thought or the speech in this moment? And then I also think it's important to reflect on the times when you didn't speak up just as much, which happens, you know, when I saw racism in action, or when I see something that you know is wrong and you should speak up, and you feel like as an ally, or if you identify as being an advocate or an anti-racist, that you made a mistake, but really sitting with that discomfort, understanding how you can do better the next time a situation like that occurs.
You summed it up well for me, Shannon.
Same.
All right. How can I push for DEI training and advocate for hiring BIPOC faculty staff at my school? It's a tough one, depending on, I think this will be different depending on what side, you know, you're on. If you're more admissions leaning, or if you're in a high school. I know for us, having people who are doing DEI work and have, you know, assigned positions, and hopefully they're getting paid something for it. I think that's really important, making sure that those folks are a part of hiring teams and have direct contact with the people who are doing interviewing, part of that interviewing process. I think all of that is really important if you're trying to change the culture at your school. I think this quote is really important. When you hire BIPOC folks into a broken culture, you don't fix the culture, you break the people. You can't have one without the other. I think the same goes for students. I think colleges are always reckoning with increasing diversity on their campus, and then not doing the DEI work required to teach people, to educate, to create safe spaces, to make sure that those communities are functioning. And I think that the push for one without the other really can't work. I think students need to see representation on campus. So it's kind of like, it's just a circular thing where everything needs to be happening, and you need to be conscientious of those. It needs to be a multi-pronged, you know, approach. You can't do one without the other. I would say there are lots of, NemNet is a really great hiring firm that can, if you advertise with them, hopefully you can get candidates of color and kind of increase your pool of applicants of color in that way. I think working with DEI consultants is important, making sure that your board is on board with the work that you're doing as well. This has to be a concerted effort from the top down, and it can't be done, you know, halfway. So I think taking those steps and making sure that you're, you know, looking at those different data points. I work with Lawrence Alexander at my school in particular with Carney Sando, and he says data, not drama. I think numbers, stats, those are really important things. There's tons of studies out there that show that students of color perform better when they have people they can see themselves as at their schools. And I think none of our schools want to be, you know, from a, it sounds crass. I wish that everybody just in terms of compassion was moved to do diversity work, but it doesn't always work that way. So in terms of how, you know, talking about how are our competitors or our peer schools doing on this front? What are their numbers? Have you done a belonging survey for your staff and faculty and students to see what they need and what their wants are? And are you going to ignore that if you have that data? I think those things are really important if you're trying to push that conversation forward.
And the knowing your audience, I think we all have, so in my opinion, this is being framed in the sense of, if you are kind of someone on my level, right? Like, I'm just a senior admissions counselor. Yeah. And so I'm definitely not at the top of the totem pole, not in supervisory level or anything like that in a leadership role. And so in that sense, what can I do? And I've learned to frame the conversation. Sometimes, and especially if you've been in an institution for a while, you know who you're talking to a little bit better and what really resonates with them. And so for some people, it's going to be that data, the data, not the drama. They want to see the numbers, the statistics, the analysis, and that's what they want. And so I really like that because that's how my brain works. And so my colleagues that work that way, we're on the same page. There are going to be some supervisors and those in leadership that are really kind of more of the ethos. They want that emotional. They want you to connect with them. But then you also have those that are really focused on kind of what's happening in the future and kind of what you can do moving forward and how this connects to the yield and how it connects to mount and everything else. And so being able to frame those in a sense that you're connecting with them the way they want to hear things and the way that they look at them can be super helpful in moving that line and moving towards much more DEI training and different conversations within your organization.
There's some great conversation happening in the chat. We would love if you share your resources, and we will add them to the end of the presentation so that when we share it out, everybody can have access to those resources as well. Whew, this was a tough one. We struggled with this a little bit, just kind of defining reporting and recording systems and creating anti-racist policies. We talked about our own institutions a little bit, but I think one of the most important things that we recognize is that you must have BIPOC colleagues involved in the creation and implementation of these policies and procedures, and that they need to be transparent. We talked about this. Well, we see this a lot in discipline and honor councils, and who is represented on those, what students are elected to be on those councils, and how important representation is in that process.
Yeah, I would also add at our school, we're working really closely with our alumni. I know at many schools, alumni have been more centered in conversations recently, particularly after the events of George Floyd's murder. You know, people want change to happen and they want accountability for that. I think it's a good sign if your alum are coming back and care enough about your institution and enough about that change and making sure that it happens. So we're working with them and looking at our handbook to see where we can make changes. Parents are looking at it as well. We're working with a DEI consultant, again, to see where our blind spots might be and making sure that the right constituencies are involved in these conversations to make sure that we have the right lenses that, you know, to use when we're looking at some of what we do. I know there's a lot of conversations also about restorative justice practices and what it means for truth telling and having people come back into your school and air some of the things that the hurt that they've experienced, the racism that they've experienced, and talk about how to move forward from that and how to heal before you can move forward also. So there are some really great projects that folks are working on as well through NAIS and other organizations to kind of figure out not only what to do in the future, but how to, again, heal the past. And I think it's really important before moving forward to recognize mistakes and missteps from the past as well.
Okay, so what can Black women do when white women weaponize their tears? It's rough. So staying calm and content with yourself. Again, going back to family, one thing that my cousin said to me when I was really young and in high school and has resonated with me for forever was, you do not fight fire with fire, you fight fire with ice. And so that's always been in my brain of what it means to be the more emotional person in a conversation. Simply because as soon as a white woman cries, she is now the victim. And if I as a Black woman, if I respond to that the same way that she does and I get emotional, I immediately become the angry Black woman in the office. And that's not something that I can shake even a year or two down the line. So it's always how you feel and how comfortable you are in that space and moving forward. There is nothing wrong with walking away. there's also nothing wrong with coming back to it, whether it's with that person, whether it's you walking away from it and not thinking about it for a while and coming back and sitting and like, okay, what could I have done? What do I do the next time? But then there's nothing wrong with coming back to it and, if need be, going and speaking with a colleague or someone in leadership, your supervisor, whatever it may be, because for me, my biggest concern with that weaponization is always the impact that it has on what other people see and how I'm treated moving forward when it comes to getting that next opportunity in the office and what that looks like. And so I want to be able to put my side on the table when it comes to those that are in leadership positions, when it comes to the colleagues that I do work with closely. And so with that, you just advocate for yourself in that sense. It also kind of goes back to the calling out and calling in of what you decide to do in the space that you're in. But me, just from experiences, I will never get defensive because I don't feel like I can. I never feel like I can. And so for me, it really is just that reflective sense of sitting back and staying calm. One thing that I will do though, I will ask, why are you crying? And that's always, you always get a different answer. But it always, again, goes back to that accountability aspect of, I am more than happy to let that white woman know that she is the one that put herself in that own situation. Like, there is nothing that I said that put her there. It's something that she said that I responded to that put her in that position where she felt upset and victimized. And I didn't do that to her. And I do not take ownership of that at all. But also, other allies, when you are there, come get your people, please. Because there are times where I can't do anything. There are times where I don't feel comfortable doing anything. And especially if you are a white ally and you see that, that is your opportunity to really be an ally and an advocate and an accomplice. It's right there.
Yeah, I would say when we were going over that, Shannon and I were basically like, we need to get our people when that happens, because we put people in, we center ourselves when we use tears, and we continue to feed into the angry Black woman racist kind of identity that people kind of put onto Black women. We need to definitely not stay silent and step up when that happens and get our people.
And we should all be angry. All of us should be angry in these situations. And if you have that feeling of these aren't my people or not all white people, then that's really something to kind of examine. Oh, these are our people. And to be a better ally, we have to be the ones that speak up.
Okay, this is our last slide, right? Kind of under the gun. As a white person, how can I be a supportive supervisor to women of color? I think earlier we talked a little bit about making sure that people are aware that you invite the conversations. I think in offices where it's a conversation that doesn't happen, or it happens when something comes up, but it's not part of the identity of your office, your institution, it's not embedded in the culture in a real tangible way, it's harder to feel supportive when you don't hear it, coming out of people's mouths and when you don't see the action. So I think finding ways to publicly make sure that you're showing support for these conversations and inviting them. And again, not just being a performative ally, not just doing it when other people are around, when you have your supervisor come in, but doing it always when not everybody's looking necessarily is really important. Again, action, when you do things, I think they will be genuine if they are genuine. I know there was a question also about how do you do this work in a way that comes off as genuine. I think if you are being genuine, if you are doing this work in public, behind the scenes, it will naturally come off as genuine. I think it comes off as disingenuous when it's only in public, only around certain people, only in a way that you're expecting to receive a thank you or praise or something back from it at the end of the day. So I think just making sure that those conversations are happening often is the first step in terms of making sure that you are showing that the culture of your office or institution is pro these conversations and that you want to be supportive and you understand the structures at play.
And I think one thing definitely to think about when you're having these conversations as the supervisor and the white person in the situation, for us, it can be really frustrating at the end of the conversation or whatever it may be when you say, okay, well, what do I do? Maybe kind of switch that and say, okay, well, what do you want me to take away from this conversation? What has been the most impactful aspect of what we talked about? It can be really hard for us when you say, well, what am I supposed to do? It's depending on where we are level wise, that's not something that we necessarily feel comfortable telling you. We would really hope that the conversation just kind of moves and you start to get ideas because that's what the conversation is for.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. I know there were some additional questions that came, these are kind of the first batch of questions that came through and unfortunately we're out of time. We'll try to maybe answer those questions in this document. I think it was sent out already, but I think it's a live document, so maybe we can update that. But it was such a pleasure working with Morgan and Ashley. Thank you so much. And thanks for attending today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much to our panelists for kind of leading us in this really important conversation. Shannon mentioned this, but the full presentation is in the chat. So definitely make sure to check that out if you wanted access to some of the links that were shared or these resources. And then we also shared some other links that were shared by a professional in the chat as well. I want to say thank you everyone for attending our final webinar of the fall series. But be on the lookout for announcements about the spring webinar series, which is coming soon. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope that you all have a really happy holiday season.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.